Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
It's the week ending Saturday the 1st of October, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the Bank of England buying UK government bonds following the Chancellor's so-called fiscal event, Hurricane Ian leaving hundreds of thousands of Floridians without power, and the death of Grammy-winning rapper Coolio at the age of 59. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team, it's the boss man, Holden Frith. From the podcast Today in History with the Retrospectors, it's Arion McNicoll. And we welcome back co-host of the One Decision podcast, journalist Julia Macfarlane. And Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Why a 90-year-old cardinal isn't feeling so zen.
He's a wonderful, brave, courageous, tough pastor. I know him reasonably well. He is precisely the sort of person one wants as a leader of the church in Asia and elsewhere. He's been an outspoken advocate for a sensible Catholic view of social policy, of human rights and civil liberties. He's one of the most important Catholic Christian leaders in Asia. He's a truly great and decent and honourable man.
Lord Chris Patten, the last governor of Hong Kong, speaking to Radio 4's Sunday back in May. Julia, who was he talking about?
So he was talking about the 90-year-old Cardinal Zen, and anyone who has been watching events in Hong Kong over recent years, the growing pro-democracy protests and then the subsequent clampdown and crackdown from the authorities with the backing of Beijing, I think a lot of us will have been wondering when something was going to happen to Cardinal Zen, to be honest, because he is an extremely outspoken supporter of these student activists, of the pro-democracy activists. And earlier this year, he was arrested along with a bunch of campaigners. And they were arrested because they were accused of colluding with foreign powers. Now, what they did was they all worked together to raise money and support for pro-democracy campaigners who had found themselves on the wrong side of Beijing's draconian new security law in Hong Kong, which brutally punishes people for speaking out against the government.
And what happened this week?
So this week, Zen and his 5 fellow pro-democracy campaigner colleagues found themselves in the courtroom now. The trial is now underway. They all pleaded not guilty in court in Hong Kong. The charges, which originally were the accusation of colluding with foreign powers, has been watered down slightly. They're now accused of not properly registering their fund as a society. Now, Zen is one of the most well-known clerics in Asia. He's been an advocate for civil rights for many years, and the Vatican has denounced the fact that he's been hauled in trial for this and releasing statements saying that the Holy See was concerned and was following the development of the situation with extreme attention. The White House also commenting on it earlier this year when he was first arrested.
But it's not quite as simple as that, the Pope's position, is it, Holden? It's not quite as straightforward as you might think. It's not just, one of my guys is in trouble here. There's more to it than that.
Yes, and I think even in that reaction where the Vatican talked about being concerned and monitoring the situation, it's diplomatic and it's because they are effectively involved in an act of diplomacy with the Chinese government. There was a deal struck between the two a few years ago, which is now being renegotiated. And essentially it was an attempt to heal a rift within the Catholic Church, which had emerged over the past few decades, where you had a sort of split between an official state-sanctioned version of the Catholic Church in China with bishop appointments being approved by the government, the Communist Party, and then an underground church, which saw itself as the kind of true representative of the Pope and the Vatican in China.
Yes, and Zen Arion, was one of the leading figures against the Vatican's engagement strategy with China.
Yes, that's right. So he said in a piece in the New York Times that he worries that any attempt to unify the Chinese church will actually lead to what he called the annihilation of the real church in China. And Zen, of course, served as bishop in Hong Kong, where the so-called Basic Law states that residents have both freedom of conscience and also freedom of religious belief. And that doesn't exist in mainland China. And since 2020, when China imposed this broad national security law for Hong Kong, it had the stated aim of combating secession, subversion, terrorism, all of the things that the pro-democracy movement was accused of. But actually, it had this sort of secondary purpose, which, as various church activists and Falun Dafa Association representatives said, was this really sort of creeping intolerance towards religion in Hong Kong. So basically, Zen is speaking from the position of someone who's been operating within Hong Kong, but is talking about what's going on for the Catholic Church within China itself and its, the Vatican's attempts to do this complex juggle of not wanting to see a schism between itself and the version of the church in China that the state recognizes, but at the same time still standing up for what it believes in.
What do you think this means then, Julia? Because, from our point of view, obviously, it can seem unpalatable for clearly a very ethically motivated 90-year-old man to be put on trial for simply doing what you can imagine he thought was the right thing to do and helping demonstrators from Hong Kong where he's been based. I mean, he's pled not guilty to colluding with foreign forces, etc., and whatever charges they've put on him. But I mean, from the Chinese point of view, that is what he was doing. He was assisting demonstrators, and they consider that to be an enemy of the state.
Right. I think it just shows that there are absolutely no exceptions, and no easy ride to be given to anyone who could be seen to be accused of undermining Hong Kong's authority and by extension China and the authority and the rule of the Chinese communist power. And I think what Arion said about the creeping intolerance of religion in Hong Kong is very important, because another thing that happened this year was after 33 years, it was the first year that there were no vigils held in Hong Kong in remembrance of the Tiananmen Square massacres. And, that was always a very, very powerful, very visible, not just act of defiance, but sort of adherence to the historical events which have been revised on the Chinese mainland. And, despite all the pressure, those masses happened every single year. And it was also a way for many of Hong Kong's 400,000 Catholics to come out together. And, what this is all about is the really quite fragile nature of the CCP, which is unable to have anything else that could take precedence in people's lives over their authority. And if you go to a church in China, you don't see statues of Jesus and Mary. You are starting to see more and more pictures of Communist Party officials and Xi Jinping, and they no longer say the Nicene Creed in Catholic mass services in China. They instead pledge allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party.
Are you surprised, Holden, that we've seen very little outrage about this in the UK?
Well, I think we've had other things on our mind. I think partly this is because, as has been said a couple of times, it is a sort of creeping form of intolerance. There hasn't been any one big moment that you can draw attention to it. When the situation in Hong Kong has probably got more attention than in mainland China, and those have been around the protests against the extradition law in 2019, and then the introduction of the national security law, which was partly in response to those the following year. And I think alongside those, the sort of religious intolerance has perhaps gone a little bit more under the radar, in part perhaps because it feels anachronistic, the idea of religion being a threat to state power, that a state would then try and kind of clamp down on it. It really does sort of take us back several centuries in Europe and in democracies, and it's maybe just a little bit harder to get a grip on that.
I think the other reason may be that there's been less attention to this story than there might have been is because the first charge that Zen, or that the authorities said Zen was going to face, this idea of colluding with foreign forces, that one would be punishable with life in prison. But in actual fact, what they've ended up charging him with is a much lesser crime that has a maximum penalty of about £1,000. So he doesn't face the sort of sanction that he might have done had this charge of colluding with foreign forces actually gone through. Instead, he's fighting against the idea that he had been involved in the trusteeship of a humanitarian fund that actually he doesn't even dispute. What his defense argued was that the fund's political views were irrelevant to the charge of whether it had registered correctly, which is what they're trying to stick on them. The authorities probably realize that this is a hot potato from their end as well, and perhaps that's why we're not seeing this really very popular former bishop being sent to prison here.
For Pope Francis, though, Julia, you've got to think in centuries, haven't you, if you're running the Catholic Church? Yeah, he might be upset about the fact that this guy's on trial. It doesn't look good, but he's thinking, how can we ensure there are Catholics in China in 100 years' time?
Yeah, but I mean, Cardinal Zen spoke out against this deal that Pope Francis brokered with the CCP, and I think there are a number of issues about it, and one of them is that the deals were never made public. I mean, the Catholic Church is not exactly the most transparent of organizations in the first place, anyway. But I mean, what exactly did the Vatican get in exchange as part of that deal? And something I think that was very interesting was that shortly after the deal was signed, Bishop of the Diocese of Mingdong in the southeastern province of Fujian, he was at the center of some of the fallout this deal, because he was then urged by the Vatican to step aside from his position for an official who was recognized by the communist government. And, there is an argument that when the Catholic Church was underground in China, it was still a Catholic Church that Catholics abroad may have recognized, whereas the Catholic Church now, which is the state-sanctioned Catholic Church, as I mentioned, I think if I were to go to mass services in China, I would find it very, very different and possibly quite difficult to take part in a service that would ostensibly venerate Xi Jinping more than the god of the religion itself.
Because of that secrecy, religious commentators have mostly had to try and work out what was in the deal by looking at the practical effects that have followed, as Julia is saying. And I think one of the contours of it seems to be that the way bishops are appointed now in China is that the Vatican puts forward a shortlist, and effectively officials in Beijing choose which of those are acceptable to them. And this has produced a lot of criticism, really, of the Roman Catholic Church as sort of, almost legitimizing an authoritarian state in a way that feels very strange, really. To me, at least, it does. But I think that in some ways, the Church is involved in supporting the policies of an authoritarian government, and I think to a lot of outsiders, this does look like an odd thing for the Roman Catholic Church to be involved with. But in some ways, it is actually a return to form, because this is how the Catholic Church operated for centuries. By coincidence, I was editing our morning newsletter last Friday, and we have a little snippet of what happened on this day. I think you missed this particular one on the retrospectors, but Friday was the 900th anniversary of the Concordat of Worms, which was an agreement between Pope Calixtus II and Emperor Henry V of the Holy Roman Empire. And in this concordat, both sides agreed to divide up the authority to create bishops in a way that looks very similar to how the church operates in mainland China. And I think that, this is, again, another kind of current that makes it quite difficult for modern media in the West, people who have lots of things on their mind, to kind of really drill into this, because it does feel like one of those, stories from long lost history where you're talking about schisms and concordats and beliefs, and it doesn't really fit into the kind of pro-democracy narratives we're used to.
What do you think it means, Arion, for the 12 million strong Catholic community in China?
Well, I think coming back to that question of, the secrecy of this deal and what the Catholic Church could have hoped to get out of this, Holden mentioned the word schism, and I think that is really what Pope Francis is mostly trying to avoid. There is this obviously the church doesn't think in these terms, but there is this great and potentially growing market for potential worshippers within China. And I suppose that the Catholic Church's hope is that they may be able to attract as many of those people to its flock as it possibly can. And it doesn't want to see the Catholic Patriotic Association completely split from itself forever. And I think that that is why it's such a complicated and nuanced question. And that's why Zen, in this particular moment, finds himself as this sort of focal point for a number of really, really enormous forces.
Okay, Holden, you're up next after this.
Can do is more than just an attitude. Can do is unwavering support in challenging times. It's the expertise to try to minimize risk while maximizing opportunities. Can do is being right here for you through every eventuality. Can do is Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management. Visit candowealth.com to see how we can help you build your wealth with confidence. Investment involves risk, and you may not get back what you invest. It's not suitable for everyone.
So, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
It's time for a policy of hive immunity.
American foul brood is a very infectious disease because it spreads easily within a colony and between colonies. It's also considered the most destructive of bee diseases, not only because it kills colonies that it infects, but because in a lot of places, including New York State, in order to eliminate this infection, colonies must be destroyed.
American Foul Brood, an informational video from Dice Lab for Honeybee Studies YouTube channel. Holden, those words I just said, what do they mean?
Well, this is the news that a company called Dalan Animal Health secured a $3.6 million investment, which is going to allow it to start producing a vaccine to protect honeybees from the condition we've just been hearing about, American foul brood.
Okay, what is American Foul Brood?
Well, the first thing about it is that despite its name, it's found worldwide. It's a bacterial infection that affects honeybees and a few other species of bees. It affects them in their very early days when they're still larvae, and it kills a very large number of them. But because it's so infectious, what it actually means is that in commercial production, as soon as it's spotted, not just in New York State, as we've heard, but also in the UK and across the EU, the authorities require hives to be burnt and all equipment to be destroyed or sterilized. So it's very damaging to bees. It's very damaging to beekeepers. And this is a particular problem at a time when bee populations are declining very sharply in a lot of places around the world.
Okay, so good news for bees potentially. Why should it matter to us?
Well, it matters mostly because bees are responsible for pollinating such a large percentage of the food we eat. I've seen various figures for exactly what that percentage is, but somewhere between a third and a half of all food species do depend on bees for their cultivation. Yeah, this is a really big issue, both for sort of the agricultural economy, but also just being able to feed ourselves.
Julia, I don't know about you. I didn't know that you could give an insect a vaccine at all. I mean, how does that work?
So I think this vaccine is given orally to the queen bee, and it goes into her ovaries, and she produces eggs that have the denatured virus that basically means that they are sort of vaccinated against this. I mean,
trickle-down
this is
economics.
all new. Yeah. No, but I found this absolutely fascinating. Yeah, but do you know, it's funny because there are a few COVID related strands to this. When I was reading up on this story, I found this study in Australia that was trying to deal with mites that were a danger to their bee populations, and when the researchers found out about this, they had to impose lockdowns on their bees, which I thought was so cute. Imagining bees like, stay home, stay safe, and doing all the things that we were doing during the pandemic. But it's fascinating because there was another similar study, because as Holden points out, we depend so much on bees, and so anything they are vulnerable to has such knock-on impact. And it seems that there are lots of studies on the health of bees and how to protect them from diseases. But a really fascinating one that was looking at how to vaccinate bees back in 2015 was trying to work out how a queen bee naturally passes on immunities to her eggs because she only eats royal jelly, and the royal jelly is made from nutrients that the worker bees bring from the outside. And what they found was that the bees that buzz around in the nearby sort of area close to the hive, when they come into contact with outside sort of pathogens and bacteria, they bring it into the hive and they make this royal jelly for the queen to eat on. She eats it, and then she passes on those immunities to the larva. And so on top of passing it on through the eggs, the action of the worker bees coming in and bringing new strains, it has the effect of double vaccination in a way. And so it's a sort of in nature way of explaining why boosters work by layering on your vaccines. And I just thought that was absolutely fascinating. I don't quite understand it, but I thought it was really, really interesting.
But to take a COVID analogy then, Arion, what about the bees that aren't vaccinated? Aren't they then susceptible to a mutated version of this disease? Because there are loads of wild bees, right? It's only the ones that are being farmed, presumably they're being vaccinated. The bees don't know they're owned, do they? They fly out there and come into contact with other ones.
That's right. And also, we associate bees very firmly with honey, but this is a bit of a misconception. Less than 5% of bee species actually make honey, and only honeybees and stingless bees produce enough honey to make it worth harvesting. And it's notable that this new technology really is targeted at honeybees and the kinds of bees that live in colonies. Lots of bees live very solo existences. This really is targeting a very particular problem. But it's important because some researchers have argued that honeybees themselves should be considered in the same category as livestock or other production animals, but because they're insects, research and development for vaccines for them and for other kinds of, treatments have been really held back. And I think that this indicates that there's more money going into this really, really important side of a thing that we've known is a problem for a long time, which is that food production depends on pollinators. And yes, if we start out with the sort of honey producing side, then that's very focused on one particular aspect of it. But it indicates that we're at least starting to take the problem seriously.
Well, and to talk about that honey bit, Holden, for those of us who buy honey and eat it, is this safer than what there was in the past? Because my understanding is before this vaccine came about, these bees were being treated with antibiotics that could actually end up in the honey.
Yeah, that's right. I think this is more of an issue in the US because there are tighter rules about what you can give to bees in the UK and EU. But not only were antibiotics widely used, but actually also chemical treatments for American foul brood were very widely used. And this vaccine, by contrast, it makes use of only a natural protein that is already within the bees and is used in the process Julia described of this sort of natural immunization, and then this modified part of the virus. So it has been certified organic by the people who control those standards, and so it is seen as a much safer option.
Would you forgive the public, Julia, for being concerned that what many of us see as a purely natural product, honey, has any kind of medical intermediary at all? Like it can make you feel a bit icky about buying something that you do see as one of the most natural, straightforward products you can buy.
Yeah, and I think the idea that, GM crops and crops that are laced with pesticides and all these kinds of things. I mean, we have, as Holden correctly points out, I think this is a bigger issue or area of concern for people in the US because they have a lot more. They have a much wider use of chemicals in their meat, everything from their cows to their meat to their crops. And in this country, the Food Standards Agency, they say that they carry out stringent tests on foods to be labeled safe. They have very high standards. They experiment about the levels present. But I think you can't get away from the fact that pretty much everything we eat has chemicals. Increasingly, a lot of the stuff we eat also has plastic. I mean, the fish that we eat, fish is meant to be is lauded as a superfood and a healthy healthy source of food for all of us. But so much of the fish, if not most fish that we eat, has lots of microplastics. And I think, I'm sitting to you here in London, where I live in a residential neighborhood, and yet at least once a week I have to wipe down the panes of my window because I get black from soot. And
you're living in Victorian times, Julia.
yeah, exactly. I mean, modern life is increasingly unhealthy, and I think there is an increasing anxiety about trying to get back to nature, stripping back, going for organic food. The issue is it's also an issue of inequality, because organic food is really expensive. A lot of people don't have the option.
And I think perhaps one of the reasons why people might have misgivings about having any intervention in the way that bees produce honey is that we might have this falsely romantic notion that the way that we get our honey, the way that honey gets onto shelves, is that, we just go out there and find lovely natural bees in the wild who are doing their pollinating and nectar collecting thing. But actually, of course, these are industrial operations to get the quantities of honey that humans actually want to consume. And consequently, it makes sense for us, if we continue to want to eat honey, as well as all of the knock-on benefits that, saving pollinators can have, to apply the same sorts of scientific, medical and professional ideas to the honey industry that we do to other food industries.
And even pollination is a business now, in that because some crops, almonds is one that gets talked about a lot. They are so dependent on bees for pollination, and because the bee numbers have been declining so sharply, there are now companies which rent out hives of bees to place within almond groves so that they can do the pollination that's necessary for that crop production.
Yeah, and is there some good news for Americans that are having their meat pumped full of foreign objects, in that this funding round that is the news that you're telling us about this week was led by a San Francisco-based VC firm, sort of tech bros getting involved in actual agriculture maybe, rather than, developing fake meat and stuff.
It's an interesting journey that this vaccine has taken, actually. It started life in a university in Helsinki, where until 2015, actually, there had been a widespread belief that insects couldn't be immunized at all because they don't produce antibodies. But then this sort of very blue sky piece of research into how insects protect themselves against diseases led to a spin-off company set up by some of the researchers involved, who have now managed to attract investment in San Francisco. And although this particular vaccine doesn't depend on any COVID-related vaccine technology, there has been a lot more interest in mRNA vaccines, the sort that Pfizer and Moderna used for COVID. And there are other bee treatments in the pipeline to protect against varroa mites, which are another common pest amongst actually a much wider spectrum of bees.
In other words, vaccines have shown themselves as a route to profitability that's a bit more accelerated than people might have previously assumed.
They're more like software in a way, these new vaccine technologies. They can be tweaked and adapted more easily.
Suddenly I'm in the sales pitch at that VC firm. It's like software, but for bees.
This podcast was brought to you by...
Bye.
But no, it's in the general conversation a lot more too. And so I think the combination of these things, and as you say, the interest of investment funds that are looking for biotech and health and science, and looking at ways to address both social issues and climate issues, means that a lot of different strands have come together here.
Olly, I can't let this segment end without encouraging you and all the listeners to look up this account on Instagram called Texas Bee Works. And it is a bee activist lady who goes around America to people who report that there are bee infestations in their attics and in their gardens. And she scoops up hundreds of bees in her hand, moves their hives, and takes them to professional sort of beehive safe sites. It is absolutely extraordinary. And she ends every single video with, "It's another great day of saving the bees."
Okay.
It's absolutely therapeutic.
I will not take that recommendation, but I'm sure many listening will. Arion, you're up next after this. Okay, Arion, you are finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This week, we discovered that the city that never sleeps is going to bed early.
your main man Dame Drops, and I'm here in New York City to check out some of the great late night eats. I'm talking about food, on top of food, on top of more food. First stop, Sarge's Delicatessen. This spot is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Sarge's is supposed to have the best pastrami sandwiches in New York City.
Top notch.
I know what I want.
Oh, you can't see the visuals, we can see. Seriously. Pile of pastrami there. I'm now hungry. Thank you, Arion. The best late night eats in New York City, a video from the Rachel Ray Show, which you can watch on YouTube. Arion, why have you made me hungry?
Well, so the reason I've made you hungry this week is because restaurants in New York are apparently reporting waves of people making 5 o'clock reservations, according to a new feature this week in the New York Times, which was entirely unheard of just a few years ago, according to the writer Rachel Sugar. And the piece offers a bunch of case studies from restaurants all across the city, all of whom attest to the fact that diners are choosing to come in earlier than they used to, with many now saying that it's harder to get reservations at like 5 or 6 in the evening than it is to get one at 7 or 8.
Yeah, 6 p.m. is the new 8 p.m.
That's right.
It says.
Yeah.
Is that right? What's behind the change then?
Well, they've put up a number of theories. One of the sort of central ones is that in people coming back from their sort of post-pandemic working from home situations, increasingly they're starting to return to the office, but a lot of people still haven't. But whether they have or they haven't gone back to the office, they're still living the same lifestyle to which they've become accustomed over the last few years, specifically having 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock be the time at which they finish their work, and using their evening meal as an opportunity to kind of punctuate the day to themselves, particularly if they're still working from home, and say, this is the end of my working day and I'm now in night mode.
Yeah, because you used to have the commute.
Right, exactly.
But now you have the pastrami sandwich.
Exactly, yeah. Well, you could get a pastrami sandwich anytime, as we just learned. But no, now it is that moment that people go, I'm switching off, I'm going to my non-working mode, and they're doing so by going to restaurants.
Okay, you said there were a number of theories. Give us one other before I broaden this out. What else might it be that's the reason people are eating earlier?
Well, one of the other suggestions was that people have changed the way that they like to socialize, and also the various sorts of fitness and health movements that we've seen over the past few years have led people to A, choose less alcohol in their diet, and B, to have various kinds of diets that can involve fasting, either fasting for certain hours during the day or completely taking days off food altogether. And those may be helping to either make people hungrier earlier if they really have fasted for most of the day, or just messed with their eating habits in really complex ways that may be contributing to this.
Well, I mean, I know New York's its own special case, city that never sleeps, etc. But on travel to the US, I'm always amazed how early in general Americans do eat compared to Brits anyway. Like, it's not unusual to see restaurants full at, say, 6:45 rather than an hour later. But it's older people, isn't it, Holden? It's the early birds, who are, tend to be the sort of, at least, let's say, 60 plus that go in at 5 p.m. I wonder whether there's another element here, which is that younger people can't afford to go out and eat anymore, which is why the restaurants full at times that older people want to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different kind of social elements to this as well. I think one other factor that was suggested in the article was staff shortages in the States, which are pretty similar to what's happened here. And so there isn't the capacity to have a big rush of people coming in at 7:30, 8, and so there are just fewer reservations available at those times, and out of necessity people have kind of been forced into earlier meals. But I think that idea that it tends to be either children or the elderly who eat their dinner at 5 p.m. is maybe also something that has pushed other people to kind of avoid those times and perhaps hold off. And it feels like the more sophisticated thing to do to eat later. And I think there's sort of, I dug back into the history of mealtimes, which is strangely fascinating, actually, and the fact that that it used to be the main meal was eaten in the middle of the day and called dinner. And it was really the development of electric light that allowed dinners to get later and later and longer. And it was the aristocracy who tended to have the latest and longest dinners of all, because they had more access to light and staff as well. And so that set a trend for others, and that became the kind of the elevated thing to do. And that's what created a gap for lunch, which is a word that didn't really come into common use until the 19th century, and actually originally meant a sort of snack between meals rather than a meal in itself. And it was then the Industrial Revolution that sort of solidified those habits and set up the rhythm, but also deepened the social signifiers of when you were eating, because factory workers tended to, having had their kind of short lunch break and then worked hard all afternoon, would eat as soon as they got home in the evening, while more leisured classes would have afternoon tea at sort of 3 or 4, and that would tide them over till they would then have a lighter meal, supper, later on.
It's also incompatible, the kind of late night eating that you see in countries like Spain, with the American business model, isn't it, Arion? That's the other thing I've always found weird. It is stigmatized, eating too early, because people say, look at these cool Mediterranean types sitting out in the piazza till 11 p.m. But that's because they've had a siesta, and B, frankly, don't work in the same way. I mean, they can go out till 1 a.m. That's not what New Yorkers can do, because they have to be up at 5.
Yeah, and also in New York, because the trendy time became to have meals in that sort of 7 to 9 o'clock, maybe even into 10 o'clock block, restaurants began to do this thing to create a buzz around their restaurant. They'd block off lots of tables for walk-ins only. And then it was really, really hard to get reservations between, in those popular hours from 6 to 9. You had to just go there and queue for ages. And A, I think people got a bit turned off by that. But B, that's another reason why actually, if it's easier to get a booking at like 5 o'clock, then why wouldn't you? If there's a hot new restaurant that you want to check out, then it does seem to make sense to go at whatever time you can find a table. So there's kind of that thing driving it as well.
Although I don't know, Arion, if you looked at the comments in the New York Times article as well, I think it's probably worth saying that despite this kind of anthropological conversation we've been having, a lot of the readers of the New York Times pinned it down to crime. They said, there's a spike of crime in New York. I don't feel safe on the subway in the evening. That's the reason. Like, there's no sophistry about it.
That was fascinating, and I did dig into the comments and looking at like all the different theories that New Yorkers had, including things like, the city becoming more conservative, more Republican, people eating earlier because they have to get up and go to work in the morning so they can pay their taxes and so on. As you say, one of the big recurring themes was it's about crime. And that's so interesting. I then looked into it, and there is this feeling in the US and in New York in particular that the city is getting more dangerous. There's an element of truth to it. Homicides are actually up. There have been a number of high-profile incidents that have kind of been in the press and have fanned the flames of people's fears. But actually, violent crime rates are still at historic lows. But the Democratic mayor, Eric Adams, has made being tough on crime one of his core campaign platforms. And so it serves his narrative to have like crime as a central issue that needs to be addressed by, guess what, people like him. So I think that idea that people are afraid to go out once the city gets dark, there may be some truth to it. It's just not true that the city is more dangerous than it's only slightly true, but it's not significantly true that the city is more dangerous than it used to be.
Nothing like homicide to harm your digestion. Do you think this could spread to the UK, Holden? Do you think, there's that whole nylon thing, isn't there? Do you think London and then ultimately the rest of our cities could follow?
I think the eating out culture is very different here. I think in New York especially, it's much less common for people to cook their own meals at home. It tends to be that eating out is about daily sustenance rather than a treat or a special occasion, which I think it still is much more here. And so I can't see it catching on particularly widely. I think here people are more likely to see the meal as the event of the evening and not something that you would do quickly on your way home from work. So
But also, New Yorkers tend to live in smaller apartments, don't they? That's the other thing, Julia. And I guess that takes us to the work from home thing again. But there's an element of one of the reasons they used to eat out is because their kitchens are tiny. Also, if you've been working from home, you just want to get out of there by 5 p.m, presumably.
Yeah, no, I think that's entirely true, and I'll never forget seeing a colleague of mine who recently got promoted, and he decided to celebrate by getting a new apartment and took a tour around his new flat, and it was absolutely tiny, and I was like, and I remember thinking this chap is several ranks above me in the company. I mean, and this is why don't you come in London, because you could afford a mansion in Wimbledon for what I expect you're on. But I think it's true because if you're working from home all day, there are differing views on whether people are becoming more efficient and able to do more work in a shorter amount of time that way or not. You really want to get out and have a change of scene by the time 5 o'clock sort of rolls over. And I do think what Arion says about the perceptions of rising crime. I mean, it's entirely anecdotal, but it is something that I personally have noticed a lot in recent trips to New York. You see, particularly in a country that has no umbrella or no safety net for people who suffer with mental health conditions or health problems, that they do not have social welfare like we do in this country. And the fact that even that I have noticed that the cost of surviving in New York, the cost of groceries, the cost of bottled water, of breakfast cereal, of bread, is getting really quite costly for me. I can't imagine how the poorer denizens of New York deal with it. And I have noticed more people are sleeping out in the streets. There are more troubled individuals on the subway. It feels scarier to be out late at night. And so, it's an anecdotal observation for me, but one that I entirely sort of understand the citizens of New York are increasingly coming to.
Right, quickly, what time do you eat dinner, Julia?
No, I never stick to the same time every day. I'm an absolute hapless mess when it comes to scheduling my days. It can be early, it can be
Well, that's
way too
revealing.
late, but I'm obsessed with cooking. So if I cook something complicated, I can be in the kitchen until God knows when, getting it right.
Holden, you're a straight down the line 7:15. Am I wrong?
Pretty much. I aim for 7. It's usually probably 7:20 on average.
Yeah.
Very Mr. Average.
Arion, kids in bed. I'm thinking maybe an hour later.
Exactly. We either we eat with the kids, which is 5 o'clock, or we preferably leave it until later, and then it could be any time at all until we absolutely pass out at 10 o'clock.
Okay. Well, I'm off down to Elaine's with Michael Caine and Mia Farrow. In the meantime, my thanks to Julia, Holden and Arion. You can follow this show for free and get every episode as soon as it's released, like a delicious pastrami sandwich. Just search for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tap follow. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to unwrap next week,